Hi everyone! Today we have a show where, as you see, I'm sitting right next to our guest. It's David Dunn. He specializes in electricity and grids. It's a fantastic discussion that we're going to have. David, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, was a long-term China hand. I studied Chinese in high school and then in college, and then I've worked in a number of different industries, mostly related to power generation and energy issues. But about 20 years ago, I got into the power generation business, particularly trying to help Chinese companies to reduce their nitrous oxide emissions from power stations, which in China are mostly coal-fired, and to try to control them better so they could reduce one very important form of pollution with relatively low expense.
Okay, and what's your experience when you went to their power plants, when you talked to the engineers? What did you find out?
What I found out basically is that they don't really care that much about pollution. They care about managing the numbers so they look good to the authorities, but they really don't care too much about the actual performances of the plant because they can make up whatever numbers they need to make up. One of the things I noticed in the power plants is that they would almost all report the same level of emissions. And that wasn't only for nitrous dioxide, there's two primary pollutants you worry about in power plants. One is sulfur dioxide, which is basically something that is inherent in the fuel, which is coal. And then nitrous oxide, which happens from the combustion of a fossil fuel, in this case coal, and in the presence of oxygen. So basically those are the two pollutants. And I noticed basically they were claiming that their level of emissions were as good as the very best plants in the United States. And in fact, in the case of nitrous oxide, they were about one half of the very best plants in the United States. But you go back and you look at the plants in detail, and basically I had full reign over the plants. You find that many of the gauges don't work, many of the gauges that they use are not the right gauges. And then the ultimate thing I found out was that there was a separate organization responsible for collecting the emissions data, which was not responsible to the power plant, and it was very suspicious. And what I came to realize is that group that was collecting the data on emissions was basically the Fix-It organization that was coming in from outside the plant to basically make sure that all the numbers look good and that all the local EPA was happy and that they got their approvals and everybody was happy, but with no attention to resolving the fundamental problem, which was to try to get pollution reduced from the power plants.
I know you have also interesting things to say about the coal itself, about its quality, and about the logistics, how it's being transported.
Okay, well, the problem you've got now is in China is in what they call peak coal. This has only happened in a few years ago. A few years ago, people talked about peak oil, which was the idea that most of the oil that was available for use in industry and for humans was basically tapped out. But we came to realize that in more recent years that China has entered into a period of peak coal, which basically means that their coal production nationwide is going to continue to decline. But it's actually worse than that because in the past, a lot of coal came from kind of the northern central part of the country, which is particularly Shanxi was the big province that had huge amounts of coal, but also in the same general area, Henan Province and Shanxi, which is the province next door to Shanxi, they also had substantial amounts of coal, but those resources have been largely tapped out. And so now the new coal comes from further north and further west, and it comes from Xinjiang, which is the province where the Uyghurs are, and then the other area would be Inner Mongolia, which is obviously a lot of Mongolians there. But the problem with those areas is they're very far away, and particularly Xinjiang is really far away. So to get that coal to the market, it's quite expensive. You have to either have very expensive infrastructure to burn the coal locally and then transport the electrons via high pressure cables. Well, they don't call them high pressure cables, right? High voltage cables, sorry. Or you transport the cable via rail, or you transport the coal via rail to the market which is mostly in the south and in the east of the country. So both of those things require tremendous investment, and I don't know so much about the high voltage cables, but I do know about the rail capacity. The rail capacity is largely insufficient to transport the coal that distance. So if you don't have the rail, you have to use trucks, and to truck that coal thousands of kilometers across the country is just ridiculously expensive. In the United States, for instance, a lot of the coal comes from, about 50% of the U.S. coal comes from the western states, Montana and Wyoming and places like that, and it's rail across the country to where the coal is demanded in the east. But the cost, if rail was not available to transport that by truck, is just horrendously expensive. And China doesn't have the low speed rail capacity that they need to transport that coal economically. What they have done instead is blown a lot of money on very high profile, very sexy, very attractive kind of technology for high speed rail, but that really is not rail. That's not capacity you use to transport commodities, bulk commodities like coal and steel. You use that for passengers. And so what they have is they have lots of rail capacity, but the wrong kind.
Okay, so you're saying the situation would get worse because you mentioned the peak situation. So does it mean that they had blackouts a few years back, right? Right after they banned and rejected the Australian coal. Is it related somehow to the situation with Australia because their coal is not good enough? And in connection with that, would the situation get worse?
The situation will get worse, and it will get worse partly because actually the Australian coal is actually better quality than is typical in China. The coal that they have in Western China tends to be lower rank, so it's has more water in it and less carbon, and so it's not. So you transport a ton of that coal, and it has less value than to transport a lot of the coal that used to be readily available in Shanxi. So the transport cost is even more relevant because the quality of the coal is lower. And the reason why they're so dependent on importing coal is because the places that are the most vulnerable to supply shocks are basically the places that have the highest GDP. You know, China, about 1/3 of the exports from China come from the Pearl River Basin outside of Hong Kong, and then another third come from the Yangtze River Basin, which is in the area around Shanghai. And both of those areas are very far from the northwest coal supply. So particularly the area outside of Hong Kong really is needing and dependent on importing coal from Australia and sometimes from Indonesia. And so they really cannot afford to embargo or deny Australia the opportunity to sell coal to China, because China really needs that coal, and it needs it in the southeast part of the country particularly.
But they made it a few years without the Australian coal. It's just recently that they loosened the restrictions, right? So they kind of survived without the Australian coal. They've made it.
I don't know how well they survived. You know, they typically, power plants run with about a 90-day supply of coal, so they would have had some stock. So they might have still had some production from the closer areas like Shanxi. So there's still some production there, but it just keeps going down and going lower and lower. So it's going down.
It was COVID time when the production was down anyway, so maybe that's why it was also a bit easier.
I don't know what COVID had, but the long-term trend is that they're going to need to continue to import more and more coal.
But they're opening more and more power plants, so it means there would be need for more and more coal from abroad. It makes them very dependent.
Because they're opening more power plants doesn't mean they necessarily have a growing demand for power. Part of what they do is they build power plants partly to stimulate the economy. It's just like with the rail capacity. It's not so much about the demand for power plants as it is the demand for projects to keep people employed. So,
But that's interesting. How do you know that they wouldn't? So it means they wouldn't even use them. They just need to build them.
no, there's been times in China where they've had tremendous overcapacity of power plants. And so what happens is they use the power plants to stimulate the economy. But then the other thing they do is they don't maintain the power plants very well. So power plants that you might last 60 or 70 years in the United States might only last 15 or 20 years in China. And this is kind of typical for China. I just read something recently that housing stock in China, the average life expectancy of a dwelling in China is only 35 years. In the United States, it's about 70 years. In Europe, it's probably higher than the United States.
Yeah, you hear constantly about those. They call them tofu projects. They collapse the bridges and overpasses and buildings. So yeah, that's probably it.
Yeah. Well, they do the same thing with power plants. They do the same thing with power plants. Partly they built like that because they were always built on the premises. Why do we need something that will last 35 years? The country's growing at 10% or 15% a year.
Okay.
So, 10 years we're going to replace anything anyway, so there's no reason to do it very well. But now China's not growing at 10% a year. They're growing at 2 or 3% a year. And so things need to last, but their mentality is not caught up with their need for better quality. And I'll tell you quite frankly that China, without the expertise and without the supply base outside of China from the OECD countries, so that's Europe, America, and Japan, is going to have a very hard time to come up with infrastructure that's any better quality than it is today. In fact, it's likely to get worse.
But that's interesting because they always present it as this, meritocracy and lots of engineers and, universities, high schools, everything top level. But it turns out it's not like that. That's why they need to steal all the IP from the West and import knowledge.
Well, I think the idea of China as a meritocracy kind of went out with when Xi announced that he was going to stay on forever as a
chairman.
As the chairman. Xi Jinping is basically has a PhD in elementary school studies. Xi Jinping really doesn't have much more than an elementary school education, like Mao. But unlike Mao, Mao was relatively intelligent. I mean, he did a lot of terrible things, but he's still relatively intelligent. Xi is not even intelligent. So Xi really doesn't know what he's doing, and so they're prone to make a lot of mistakes. Unfortunately, he doesn't know what he's doing very well, but then again, he controls everything, so that's a very bad combination.
Let's talk about the other funny Western topic, green energy. So China, obviously, they do a lot of PR and promotion, but I don't think they really go in that direction. So there is also not much hope in this regard. So what about nuclear? I know you had a story to tell about the nuclear plant you visited.
Right. Well, since you first mentioned green energy, I'll just tell you there's a dirty little secret about green energy. Let's talk about let's use green energy. Let's particularly think about wind. In the United States, in the middle of the country, the U.S. has a lot of wind resources, like China has a lot of wind resources in the far west of the country. But to harness that wind resources, you need very good distribution and transmission infrastructure, which China doesn't have, and the U.S. actually is challenged by that too. But what the U.S. does have is the U.S. has a lot of natural gas. And so the thing about natural gas fueled power stations is they tend to use gas turbines, which is a bit like the engine on a jet engine on an airplane. So the good thing about those power stations, unlike coal-fired power stations, is they can go up and down quickly, which is a very important attribute to have if you're dealing with renewables, both solar and wind, because the problem with solar, one of the big problems with solar and wind is they go up and down quickly. So when the wind dies down, you don't have any power. So you have to have something to come up quickly, or else you have blackouts and brownouts. Now, the United States, we've got lots of gas, natural gas, and so we've got a lot of power stations that run on natural gas. But China doesn't have very much natural gas at all. China is amongst the 3 countries that have the most coal in the world, the other 2 being the U.S. and Russia. But China's 12th China's well, let's see, China, U.S. and Russia are in the top three in coal, but China's number 12 in natural gas. So China doesn't have very much natural gas. The U.S. has very large supplies of natural gas, and so the U.S. has plenty of resource to match with renewables. China does not. Now, on the issue, you mentioned the issue of nuclear power stations, and nuclear power stations is something that seems to have merit for China because they need other resources other than just coal-fired power stations, particularly for their base load, which is the base load is basically power that kind of continues 24/7 and almost never goes down. It just pumps out energy all year round. There's several problems with nuclear power for China. One of the biggest is that it's very expensive. Its nuclear power stations on a per kilowatt basis is probably about 10 times what a coal-fired power station is. But the real problem of China relative to nuclear power is that they don't know what they're doing. And nuclear power, I worked in the nuclear power industry in the United States. And basically in the nuclear power industry, and they're extremely meticulous on the reporting and the level of quality that use every nut and bolt that goes into that power plant is documented. There's a report. So they sometimes say that the paperwork that goes into a nuclear power plant weighs more than the power plant itself. Now China just can't cope with that. So a few years ago, I dealt with a nuclear power project, which was a new design from Westinghouse that was being sold and promoted in China, and there was a power plant that was using this. It was the AP1000 system from Westinghouse, and I was contacted about this project because they had some testing that required a product that I was representing in China, and this product was necessary to get your permit for an AP1000 project. So I flew into Shanghai, and they showed me the design. They put the design of their testing on a whiteboard, and then they showed me the specification, which was written in English, and it was from Westinghouse. And I looked at it, and I thought, well, the first thing is what they have laid out on the whiteboard is not what is in the specification. So they couldn't even read the specification, which is a really bad sign. And then I showed them, I clarified how you actually do it based on the specification, which was in English, which they couldn't read and hadn't bothered to translate. And then, so I put in my proposal, and I'm thinking, oh my, this is great. We're going to get this project for sure. In the nuclear industry, whatever the regulatory agencies tell you to do is exactly what you do. So if they tell you you're supposed to use a number 2 pencil and it's got to be this brand and it's got to be this long, you do that. And because if you don't do exactly what they want, they will tell you, well, you haven't done exactly what we want. So until you fix that, you can't operate the plant. And the plant, to not be able to operate the plant costs you millions, tens of millions of dollars a day. So you have to do exactly what they do. But that's not what they do in China. So what ended up happening with this project is I laid them out. I told you, this is what we're going to do because we're the only one that does it this way. And then a few months later, I contacted my agent in China that was working on the deal with me, and I asked him, what happened to that project? They're going to go with that power station. That power plant is going to be put up. They have to do that testing to complete the project, and yet they haven't ordered. How come they haven't ordered? He said, oh, they already bought it. I said, they can't buy it. We're the only one that does this. They said, oh, they found something that they were happy with, and that was much cheaper than your product, so that's what they went with. But this is unheard of in the nuclear industry in the United States, but it's conventional in China.
Here I would like to add a story I heard about recently when the Japanese wanted to release the water from the Fukushima plant after the accident. And then the Chinese nationalists showed up online and said, oh, that's too dangerous, it's too toxic. And then they measured their own release from their own nuclear plants, and it turns out it's way worse than the one from Fukushima after the accident, and then they shut up. So that all fits nicely together.
Yeah, what I'm surprised by is that they actually released the real data and what their emissions was, because that's not what Chinese normally would do. They would normally cover it up. But no, I'm not surprised that they have high emissions because they cut corners on everything. They cut corners in their coal-fired power stations. They cut corners on everything I've ever seen. So that's why they have, you mentioned the construction, in Chinese they call it tofu gongtan. So tofu construction,
Yeah.
that basically a building's supposed to have so many rebar, so much strength of the concrete. They compromise all those things in order to cut the cost, and then they end up with poor quality.
And the same thing with the BRI projects abroad in Africa, the same, collapsing. Okay, the last topic I want to ask you about the livable and smart cities, because that seems to be a fancy project in China. What do you think about that?
This is ridiculous. I mean, there's two problems with it. First of all, air pollution is largely unresolved in China. Yes, they have reduced some of the SOx, because SOx is relatively more easy to resolve than NOx pollution. So they have made some contribution in reducing that, but it's not nearly. I mean, we're still multiples of the typical level of pollutants in the air in China over versus Japan or Europe or the United States. So a livable city that has 5, 6, 8 times the pollution is typical in the OECD countries is not a very livable city. And then the other issue with China I can think about is the healthcare infrastructure is woefully inadequate. You know, in China, the part of the reasons why they had to have so much of the country shut down for COVID is they had no capacity in their hospitals. So if they had a lot of people going to the hospitals, they couldn't handle them, and they would run out of oxygen and even basic measures to keep people alive.
And that was in big cities, not to mention countryside.
Oh, no doubt.
We have no idea what went there.
No doubt. The countryside's far worse because they don't care about the countryside, because they
Yeah.
really mostly
Yeah.
care about,
Boutique projects.
well, they care about cities that would be,
Yeah.
the political stability of could undermine the regime. So that's made, particularly Beijing, but also to a certain extent Shanghai, but mostly Beijing.
So those livable and smart cities are probably more about control than livability.
No doubt. Well, here's an example. So you're talking about livability. Now, Beijing is unlike every other city in the fact that in much of China, in the north of actually the Huai River, which is just a bit north of Shanghai, all cities north of that line get heating in the winter, and most of it's district heating. If any city of enough size would have a boiler, and then they would send out in steam lines heat to heat buildings. Now, in every city in China, basically, they do that heating via coal. But in Beijing, they use natural gas because Beijing is a city it's a showpiece for the rest of the world, and also they have to worry about the stability of the political system in Beijing, so it gets a better deal. But there's not enough natural gas to do that with hardly any other cities outside of Beijing. So Beijing might be semi-livable, but only Beijing. And the problem is that around Beijing, there's all kinds of cities that don't have that deal, and the air blows in from those cities into Beijing, and Beijing's not as polluted as it would be if it had sources of coal right in the city, but it's still plenty polluted.
David, thank you so much. We can only hope the same applies to the military. Let's wish them all the best. The same condition as power plants.
Well, you know, I did have a few agents in China that in addition to the power industry, they were also calling on the military, and certainly the military is just as corrupt, just as inefficient, just as incompetent as the power industry, probably even more so.
Wow.
But that is I don't know anything other than a few people told me about the military, and that was a few years ago. But yeah, my hope is that it's also a
few years ago. That's already after she supposedly cleaned everything up, so it's still a big mess.
What she did was he basically removed his people that were not his cronies. I do know that a few years ago there were some major scandals of generals that had bought their posts, and they had bought their posts because basically once they were in that post, they could make money from their post by getting kickbacks on some of the supply deals that were the military had. So I'm sure that's not been completely So I mean, but still they could be formidable militarily. They could cause a lot of damage, but perhaps not quite as formidable as they might appear on paper.
Thank you, David Dunn, for your time. It was really a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.